In this next lecture, we're going to look at cabbage worm identification, treatment, and prevention inside of our aquaponic systems and inside of our growing environments. Cabbage worms tend to target heavy greens such as cabbages, collards, kales, bok choys, and other brassicas. These worms, if left untreated, can defoliate entire plants very quickly and leave bare stems behind. Worms can be difficult to locate on plants as they are similar in color to the plant that they're feeding on or their host plant. This means that we're going to want to look for not necessarily the cabbage worms themselves, but signs of cabbage worms on our plants and in our growing environments. Cabbage worms are typically noted first by the presence of small, black droppings under the leaves on which they're feeding. In these two photos, we see the two primary indicators that we have cabbage worms on our plants. First is the obvious holes in the leaves of the plants where the cabbage worms have eaten. And secondly, if you look closely along the edges of the plant, you'll see small black specks of fecal matter left behind by the worms. Typically, it's very hard to find the worms in time to address the loss of your plant because the worms are incredibly small when they start feeding on your plants. Typically, you won't see the actual adult cabbage worm until after the small worm has had its chance to reap havoc on your crop leaves. And so if you're a grower that is growing commercially for an end consumer or for a restaurant, cabbage worms can be problematic because they can punch a lot of little holes in your produce very quickly, and this can make that produce non-saleable. Often, if you're trying to track down the cabbage worm that is eating your plants, it's good to look along the spine of the stem of the plant leaves because this is where they typically hang out when they're not feeding. And often, if you follow the main vein of the leaf downward towards the middle of the plant, you can find the cabbage worm hanging out along that stem. Just to give us some scale about how small cabbage worms can be and how much damage they can cause even when they're incredibly small, here we see a picture of a young cabbage worm underneath a microscope next to the hole that he has drilled through this bok choy leaf. The two black dots are small pieces of fecal matter that are often that early indicator sign that you have a cabbage worm problem. Of course, in addition to the hole in the leaf. The primary and, in my opinion, best treatment for cabbage worms on your brassicas and your kales and your collards and your broccoli is spinosad treatments. And there's a type of spinosad out there called Captain Jack, and it works incredibly well. Spinosad is toxic to the worms as they ingest it while they're feeding. So in order to effectively combat cabbage worms, if you know that you have cabbage worms in your greenhouse, or this is a typical problem that you experience on your brassicas, you're going to want to spray Captain Jack as a preventative measure against your cabbage worms so that if they do end up being laid on your leaves and they hatch, the moment that they start feeding, they end up dying. And so you're able to knock back the populations of cabbage worms when they're incredibly small and before they're able to do any real harm on your crops. When spraying spinosad on your crops in order to protect your crops against cabbage worms, you're going to want to spray the underside of the leaves as this is where the cabbage moths will typically lay their eggs. And so this is where the cabbage worm will emerge and will start to feed.